perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Warhammer 40k fans have had it kinda rough lately with the ups and downs of recent release Darktide, and even before that Necromunda Hired Gun and Space Hulk Deathwing both had polarizing responses from gamers. And it's actually kinda surprising to think that we've never had a really solid run and gun first person shooter set in the 40k universe, letting you run around and stomp in the skulls of heretics as an ultramarine armed with a bolter and chainsword.
Your gods have forsaken you, traitor!
Well, that's all about to change with the release of Warhammer 40k Boltgun, a throwback shooter, or boomer shooter as they're more commonly called, being developed by All Rock Digital and published by Focus Entertainment. And all I can say is that boomer shooters are about to get yet another boost in popularity because Boltgun is just ridiculously awesome and some of the most fun I've had gaming yet in 2023. Boltgun's just not a great game for 40k fans, it's a great game for fans of shooters in general. It perfectly encapsulates everything about what makes this subgenre of FPS games so much fun, and is probably the easiest recommendation I can make all year. Everyone should play this. The best way to sum the whole thing up is that it's like a first-person version of Space Marine from back in 2011. It's like someone took the raw power and carnage you had in that game and turned it into an entire FPS campaign. Which probably ain't the worst comparison to make either, because this thing is apparently some kind of a sequel, or at the very least set around the same time period. You're playing as an ultramarine sent to the planet of Graia to investigate possible chaos activity, only for the dropship to crash and the rest of your squad getting killed. Turns out the whole planet is a hotbed of hostile forces, and in true old school FPS fashion, you're taken on the role of the one-man army and have to get the job done all by your lonesome, with a servo skull as your only companion.
This servo skull will guide you.
It might annoy certain 40k fans that they can't swap out and play as any other Marine chapters or customize your weapons or any of that kind of stuff. Boltgun, however, isn't really trying to be that kind of game. Feels like it's doing its best to appeal to both casual and hardcore fans of the series. But if you're after a super lore-heavy experience though, well, you're not going to find it here. And about all the story you get comes from these very 1990s-inspired intermission screens in between each of those 3 chapters.
You'll have to move quickly if you're to get there before that infernal sorcerer.
Visually, I'm reminded of similar indie shooters like Proteus and Cultic with the graphics, having that chunky pixelated aesthetic offset with this really appealing and unique art style. Even that intro and those intermission cinematics have a whole Star Wars Dark Forces thing going on, featuring hand-drawn and highly detailed sprites combined with minimal animation and full voice acting.
I have demons to purge.
At certain levels, you'll see the manifestation of the taint left behind by the forces of chaos as you navigate through these titanic, expansive industrial backdrops, long since put out of commission and now completely dilapidated. And I've just lost count of the amount of times I've stopped dead in my tracks and spent 30 seconds or so just admiring how gorgeous the whole thing looks. Not to mention the scale of some of these environments is just really vast. There's just so many cool looking locations to explore here. It really never does get old. And oh look, they even added your mum into the game as well.
Wait a minute!
Plus the music is just amazing.
That was beautiful.
Enemies include various breeds of cultists. You've got the Chaos Space Marines, Terminators, Plague Toads, and Nurglings, along with blue and pink horrors, and yeah, not the kind between your mum's legs. Sadly though, there's no Gene Stealers or Orcs. I don't know, maybe that's in Boltgun too.
Get off my ship, Space Marine!
I love that little guy.
Despite wearing heavy power armor, I often forget how nimble these Space Marines really are, and in true old school shooter fashion, you can zip around the place pretty quickly, which is kinda handy because there's always going to be a couple of dozen enemies to deal with at any one time. Land on the ground from like a high enough vantage point and you'll even do shockwave damage, pulverizing whatever's beneath you. You can charge into enemies to knock them back or just outright kill them, which is always fun. And then power-ups like the Aura of Doom and the Assault Doctrine are more or less just like berserk packs. So they've really nailed that feeling of playing as a fully kitted out Space Marine. There is like a definite lack of damage feedback though, and by that I mean it's just not very well communicated to the player when you're taking loads of damage. Like this bit here, for instance. I take a hit from this enemy and lose 130 health points in a single hit, but if you weren't looking at the HUD, well, you'd hardly know it. And now compare this to Doom, for instance, taking a load of buckshot from like a shotgun sergeant. The entire screen goes red, you get knocked back, and without even having looked at the status bar, you know that your character definitely took a big hit. I guess it's a bit of a minor complaint, but it's something that becomes more noticeable when you're up against a bunch of enemies because you don't really notice how much damage you're actually taking.
Holy shit!
Thankfully though, you've got an absolutely devastating arsenal here to send all these heretics back to hell, along with your most important weapon, your sharp wit.
You'll drown in your own blood.
I mean, yeah, son, press that taunt button at any time to let out like a scathing barrage of words which are more damaging than catching bolter rounds to the face.
The Emperor's hand will touch you, and you will not survive.
Well, not quite, but hey, they are pretty cool.
Wake with fear.
There's just so many of these as well, and some of them are pretty damn rad. One of them even makes a reference to Captain Titus.
I will finish the work Captain Titus started.
And another one seems like a reference to the opening of Blood.
I live again.
As for the weapons, well, you start off with the chainsword, but even this thing can still be pretty useful. Able to dish out a lock-on melee attack that finishes the weaker enemies off in a single hit, but can also do some nice damage to bigger units if you mash that attack button over and over. It's a bit of a shame though that you don't get any other melee weapon like the Thunder Hammer or the Power Sword, but it's not really as much about melee here as it is shooting.
Death has found you.
Speaking of which, before too long, you come across the Bolter, which any self-respecting Space Marine should have in his arsenal. And it really is one of the most iconic weapons in their entire roster. Even though that Bolter is really one of the most basic weapons in the grand scheme of things, it's still effective throughout almost the entire campaign. And to keep it interesting, you'll find magazine upgrades hidden throughout the levels, like Dragonfire bolts, Vengeance rounds, and those armor-piercing Kraken rounds. All ammunition types from the tabletop stuff, which have been effortlessly carried across into the game and integrated into the shooting. And they're just really fun to use here, actually encouraging restraint, and not just firing full auto and hoping for the best. I don't know, I just respect the fact that the Bolter's a weapon that's more or less able to completely turn a basic human into mist after a couple of hits. And it just makes you appreciate that raw firepower you get from explosive rounds connecting with soft tissue. That glorious side of the weaker enemies getting jibbed after just a couple of hits, it really never does get old. Anyway, after that you'll find the shotgun, and really what kind of FPS would it be without one? Though it is kind of throwing me off a little bit how this thing is bound to number 2 on the keyboard instead of 3. Real ones will know what I'm talking about there. Either way though, this thing slaps pretty damn hard, and it has the kind of sound effect you'd really want and expect to hear. Fans of shooters will also be happy to know that you can swap out the shotgun right after firing it, to skip over that reload animation. And this becomes really useful early on, as along with the Boltgun, it's the only weapon you've got. Later on, as sort of an upgrade to the shotgun, you'll get the melter gun. Now look, I know it's not technically a shotgun, but it really does more or less function like one if you stop to think about it. Firing out this powerful short-range blast in a wide arc. Only instead of it shooting out a bunch of pellets like a standard shotgun shell, it's a heat blast somewhere in the tens of thousands of centigrade. And it's like literally shooting someone with the force of a sun. And I guess just for basic balancing, and also to not completely unravel the space-time continuum, ammo for this thing is kinda limited, because otherwise you'd single-handedly be able to wipe out the entire Chaos threat. In the third slot is the plasma gun, and this is probably one of the weaker weapons, not because it's not any good, I mean that couldn't be further from the truth, but because you can't swap out of this thing after firing. Because for some reason, after you've fired off a shot, you're locked into the weapon until the recharging animation is complete. And I don't know if this was like a deliberate design choice or just an oversight, but either way it makes the weapon kinda limited, because it means you can't swap to another weapon to maximize your damage output. After that, you've got the heavy bolter, which is like a heavier version of the bolter. Yeah, no shit. And this thing is so massive that your character's basically lugging it around the entire time. Kinda makes me feel like I'm playing as Jesse Ventura in Predator, carrying around old Painless. The heavy bolter takes up like half the goddamn screen, and the shell casings are about as big as beer cans. And when you absolutely positively got to execute every motherfucker in the room, except no substitute. The sound this thing makes is so loud and awesome that if you hooked up a subwoofer to the bottom of your chair, firing this thing would actually massage your prostate. Yeah, it's that good.
I like that.
Now in the 5th slot is the Vengeance Launcher, a weapon which is being carried across from Space Marine. And this is a grenade launcher that fires sticky grenades, which attach to enemies and then explode a couple of seconds later for massive damage. You've also got more basic throwable grenades, which do a lot of damage, but the cap for these is really low for some reason. Only able to hold like 1 or 2 at a time. In the case of those world-breaking vortex grenades, you'll only find them in secret areas. That one does kind of make sense though, because throw out one of these things and you'll even notice how it easily kills some of the mini-bosses. Then finally you've got the Volkite Caliber, did I say that right? And the Grav Gun. Both of which are more or less the same, firing out like a constant stream of energy like a laser that does sustained damage. You don't get the Grav Gun until I think it's like the 3rd chapter, and then even then, ammo for this thing is pretty rare. So you'll want to save this thing for the tougher enemies, but the Caliber is a really handy and useful weapon all round, which visually kind of reminds me a lot of the Plasma Gun from Doom. Now, each weapon and enemy type has a strength level, and although it's not fully explained in the game, I think the way it works is that if you match the strength level of a weapon to an enemy, it means you'll be doing a lot more damage. So if an enemy is level 5, you want to use weapons with a rating of 5 or higher, because those weapons are going to do more damage. And then you can find machine spirits on each level, which are going to boost a weapon's power even more.
Power up.
Which does sound like it makes sense, but it seems like a needlessly confusing way to just explain how the basic combat works. So yeah, obviously the heavy bolter is going to do more damage than the normal bolter. In the same way the chain gun in Doom does more damage than the pistol. It's like, no shit, better weapons do more damage than weaker ones. Just kind of like it's putting a number on what should just be common sense. And you'll just shoot enemies with whatever weapon you've currently got. Most of the time, this thing plays as a run and gun shooter, that being that you navigate the environment, you find keys to get through locked doors, and then kill whatever gets in your way. There's even often a fair bit of verticality to these levels, with jump packs appearing in certain areas, but only as more or less just preset jump pads. But then in other times, you're more or less just locked into the one area, where you've then got to purge all the enemies before moving on, more or less turning it into an arena shooter. Yeah, I said it. And honestly, I found that these areas often weren't as good, only because the game kind of lacks a lot of those features that makes arena shooters work so well. Mostly being things like a dash move, or just the ability to really move across the space quickly. So how fun these sequences are is absolutely dependent on how well that arena's been designed, and some of them are definitely lacking and just feel less enjoyable to play through than the others. Plus it also just depends on the kind of enemies that you're having to deal with. And by far the most annoying enemies are these so-called champions. Now these are Chaos Marines that run right up to you for some really damaging melee attacks, and there's a chance that after they're killed they'll get back up again and go into some sort of rage mode, making them even more dangerous. In a game where you really got no fast way to get the fuck away from something, these guys are the cream of the crop when it comes to being a pain in your armored ass. They also find those plague toads to just be really fucking irritating, and the toughest variants really just do take like an entire stockpile of ammunition to put down. Plus there's just something kind of annoying about fighting toads in video games. I always get PTSD thinking about that opening level in Daikatana, and when you're locked into a small arena and have like a dozen of these things to wipe out, it just kind of feels like intergalactic pest control. The other thing I had an issue with is the pacing of the campaign, especially for those earlier chapters. You get the first 4 weapons, the Boltgun, shotgun, plasma gun, and the heavy bolter, within maybe like the first 45 minutes. But then it's not like another 2 or so hours after that when you finally get the Vengeance Launcher, and that 2-hour-long interval is very tedious, with lots of spongy enemies like the Plague Toads to contend with, and only that limited arsenal to help you out. Then once things really start to ramp up, the first chapter comes to an end and they take all your weapons away. And then the same thing happens again in the second chapter, like right when things are starting to kick off and you've got an entire armory in your back pocket, all of your weapons are again taken away. And look, I understand why they've done this, believe me. No one gets what they're going for here more than I do. They're most likely trying to replicate those old FPS games back in the 90s where your weapons would get reset at the end of each chapter. I mean, games like Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem all did this. But that was because in those games with the end of each chapter, you were often sent to an entirely different area. Not to mention that it fit in with the whole episodic business model that a lot of those older games used to have. Here though, it kind of seems like a needlessly archaic feature, and all it really does is kill the pacing of the campaign. Because chances are most people playing this are going to get through it in a couple of sittings, if not one sitting. And to have that deliberate kick in the balls, it just kind of removes how fun the whole experience really could have been from start to finish. There is also a definite sense of repetition in the combat, not in the way that you'll see the same few enemy types over and over, I mean there's nothing wrong with that, but more in the way that the game reuses some of these tougher mini-boss encounters, which really starts to get a bit tiring. So for instance, early on you'll fight a Lord of Change. Now these are giant chaos demons that teleport all over the place and have a line of sight attack that does massive damage, and the first encounter against one of these guys could have served as the end chapter boss.
Damn it!
And you're not only having to deal with this guy, but also a constant influx of other enemies that keep spawning in. Now, ignoring just how fucking annoying it is when boss fights rely on spawning in other enemies, consider just how insanely spongy the Lord of Change is to begin with. So having to essentially replay this fight, the 3 or 4 times you have to do it for the rest of the campaign, it doesn't make it any less tiresome. The end chapter boss is always a Chaos Sorcerer, and it is always the same cycle of just trying to stay away from the guy, whilst avoiding all the other inconsequential enemies that the game is constantly spawning in, whilst you're trying to whittle away the massive health bar of the boss itself. Vortex grenades can offer up a quick and easy solution to dealing with these kinds of enemies, assuming you've got one, but there's never really anything that evolves about any of these fights. The only change is that each time you're back in that same spot, you've got better weapons. The strategy is just like taking on the Cyber Demon in Doom, know what I mean? Shoot at it until it dies. I think the only other criticism I'd make for Boltgun is the difficulty, or the often lack thereof. Yeah man, Boltgun is a pretty damn easy game, at least early on, to the point that it's just often laughable. The so-called secret areas are really just out in the open, and enemies are always really easy to deal with, often just standing in one place and shooting at you. Later levels definitely dial things up, especially in the last chapter, by throwing dozens of enemies at you at once, but it's still quite an easy game, especially by boomer shooter standards.
The Emperor's hand will touch you, and you will not survive.
There is some definite bullshit with the way that certain enemy attacks work, and they often have this weird tendency to almost attack you preemptively and seem like they're tracking your movements when you're not even in their line of sight, which does feel kind of cheap.
What the hell is even that?
But I think people who are familiar with this genre and more than capable that games like Ultra Kill or Turbo Overkill are gonna absolutely obliterate everything that this game throws at them, for the most part anyway. Then again, I don't know, maybe that's like the whole point, and when you're hopping into that iconic blue power armor, would you really want to have it any other way? Complaining about a power fantasy FPS making you feel like a force of nature might sound completely asinine, but I guess my point is if you're after like a truly hardcore crushing experience and have a working set of opposable thumbs, well, you might not find it here. Truly have to emphasize though that that doesn't make it a bad game. Quite the opposite.
You'll drown in your own blood.
All up, the entire campaign took me like 8 hours to beat, and there is definitely replayability here in going back in to get 100% kills and to find all those secrets in every level. I will say though, for a game that's main longevity is based around finding all the secrets and getting all the kills, it is kind of baffling that they didn't include an auto map. But then more than that, the fact you can't even check your level stats until you finish the level itself. Surely it can't be too hard to just incorporate some kind of basic stat screen. I also think some kind of codex menu would have really been handy too, like just a few pages of info for each enemy type or faction, seeing as not everyone's going to be as balls deep into 40k lore. Look, I don't want to spend hours trawling through a Wikipedia page learning about the history behind the melter gun, but I'd gladly sit there for 2 or 3 minutes reading through an in-game menu over the basic mechanics behind the weapon is what it is. And yeah, I know these are really just nitpicks, but I guess at the end of the day, nitpicking is probably a good thing. Considering overall, there's just really not that many genuine things to complain about. When I wasn't playing Boltgun, all I wanted to do was go back and play Boltgun.
Hey pal, did you get a load of the nerd?
And it comes back to what I said at the start of the video, and that's how this is really one of the easiest recommendations I can make all year. I just can't think of any reason to not suggest people go out and buy it right now. In fact, sitting here watching my video is time wasted, which could be better spent buying, downloading, and playing it. The whole thing is brimming with soul, charm, and character. It looks and sounds great, it's fun to play, it's violent, gory, and exciting, and it's got a decent length to it. In the age of the so-called boomer shooters with other titles like Proteus, Cultic, Nightmare Reaper, Turbo Overkill, Project Warlock, and Beyond Sunset, we've got yet another great game to add to the ranks here with Warhammer 40k Boltgun. So yeah, overall, damn good stuff, sir.